So the World Cup application project sadly has very little to do with football, in fact nothing to do with football, although I will be writing a blog post shortly that has a bunch of articles about the economics of the World Cup and the economics of football that might be interesting for your students. However, in this case, the World Cup application project mostly just uses those World Cup groups. So there are 12 groups, each with 4 countries. And you don't need to use all the groups. You can assign one group to a student, or you might have a pair of students, or a trio, or a group of students assigned to each group. So, for example, if you have 20 students, it's fine to have them in pairs and covering 10 of these countries. You don't need them all covered. Alternatively, if you need lots more groups than that, if you grab yourself one of these World Cup tournament trees, there's pictures online, but they also have them in the newspapers and stuff like that. And then you'll just have lots and lots of pairs of countries as they face off against each other. The first part of the project is pretty standard. It's looking at country profiles and presenting on that. So making a presentation of each of the interesting features of each country in their group. I've made a particular point here to say that we're looking for the interesting information here, so the stuff that makes this country slightly different. So, for example, if we're talking about Italy, then we might want to pick specifically to talk about their demographics. Whereas if we're talking about Norway, that's not going to be the number one thing we think of. Maybe we want to think of their in terms of the way that they fund their public expenditure. For example, I don't think Italy are even in this World Cup, but that's a kind of example. We want to pick the interesting information rather than just giving the same information about each country. Where we are giving information, I've asked students to make sure that they contextualize that somehow, either comparing it against the history of that country. So is it particularly high or particularly low right now? Is it rising or falling? And internationally, so compared to other countries, is this, do they have particularly high unemployment? Do they have particularly high debt or particularly low, I don't know, current account service or something? I've also asked students to make sure that they have a title slide for each country. And during that title slide, I recommend that you ask students to speak without notes, summarising what they found out about that country for approximately 30 seconds. That means that students actually have to memorise and learn things a little bit, and that just stops that complete reliance on AI. I think it would be naive to assume they're not going to use some form of AI here, but requiring them to speak without notes about a country for, say, 30 seconds or a minute, I think will at least force them to try and memorise something. I've left this line clear here for you to write how long you want them to speak for without notes, whether that's 30 seconds each or 1 minute per country or something, so that you can adjust that. So they'll do their title slide where they're giving the summary of what they found, and then they go into more detail, encouraging them to use charts and graphs and figures and things like that for each country. There's a presentation rubric here. And again, this just makes it slightly harder to use AI because we've got a number of requirements here. Some students may be able to create a PowerPoint that meets all of these needs using AI, but actually it's quite a difficult task to be able to do that using AI. You need quite a lot of AI literacy to do that. And actually, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing for students to be learning to do. So I think it does just make it slightly harder for them to just churn out anything that AI gives. But if they really want to get these top marks here, there are very specific things that are required for that. I've allowed a weighting column here for you to decide what you want the weightings of each section to be. I would maybe encourage you to have maybe 3 times weighting for the content, and maybe a 2 times weighting for the opening summary for each section, and then maybe just a single weighting for slideshow design and delivery, as that's not necessarily what we're testing as part of economics. Hopefully this rubric is clear enough that you could get students to peer mark it. I'm aware you probably have piles of reports to write at this point, so if that's useful for you, you could have a bit of peer marking going on. So I recommend that you would maybe set that for one lesson. So students do that in one lesson and they have the homework to finish it. And then either they might have another lesson if you're particularly generous, or they might then be able to present it in the second lesson. So they start off researching and then they present, everybody listens to each other's. At the end of that lesson, so the start of the next lesson, so this would be the start of lesson 3, you ask them to bring in all the notes that they made whilst they were preparing their presentation. So whether that's a printout, whether that's writing out the notes. But the third lesson in this series is going to be an analog lesson. So they won't be able to use a computer for that. So they will need to come with all of their information about their 4 countries. And the next task will be policy application. So for each of these World Cup groups, whether that's a student covering that group or a group of students covering that group, you will give them a policy. This random policy generator is on the website. It's also linked at the end of the project PDF, so you should be able to get that set up fairly easily. So you'll generate a policy, and so let's say this person has to talk about funding research into disease prevention and treatment. And the idea here is that they will have to see and assess how effective that policy would be in each of the 4 countries that they have researched. And so the idea here is that it's going to help their application skills. Students really struggle with application in macroeconomics. So they might know the features of the country. They might know that, say, I don't know, inflation is particularly high right now, but they can't then translate that to will this policy work or not. This is also particularly useful ahead of studying development economics in year 13. In this case, it might be, let's say we're Group A. So with Czechia, Mexico, South Africa and South Korea, how will the policy of funding research into disease prevention and treatment work in each of those countries? We've given them a bit of guidance. So they first need to show how and why this policy could theoretically be a good option. So what's the theory behind the policy? Then go through each country and say, okay, well, how might this policy be appropriate for this country? And in what ways might it be inappropriate for this country? And then give an overall decision as to whether or not that policy should be recommended in a given country. So for example, if you've got a country where you are struggling to manage disease, then maybe funding research into disease might be beyond your capacity, particularly if you don't have a huge amount of specialised workers in kind of pharmaceutical development. That would be very difficult for a country in that situation. So the idea is that they go through each country and they say why it would work, why it wouldn't work, and an overall assessment of whether they would recommend that policy for that country. They then need to rank those countries in order of in which one this policy would be most effective and in which one this policy would be least effective. So there's a bit of weighing up there, and that just helps that there's judgment skills that students often struggle with when they're coming to write conclusions and things like that. I've said your teacher will tell you how they want you to present and submit this. If it's a single student in looking at each group of 4 countries, then I think a written essay works quite well for this. If you've got a group project, I would recommend maybe doing a poster or something where lots of students can be working on different areas at different times. What I wouldn't recommend doing is letting students go away and do this, because AI can do this really, really easily. So we want them to be able to use the notes that they've already made and then apply them to this new situation. That's far more similar to what they'll have to do in an exam. Again, I've got a rubric so they know what they're aiming for. And there's also an exemplar answer. So this is an essay style answer, but this could appear, say, on a poster or something. So we've got the theoretical case for the policy. Then for each country, we go through which of the features of this country make this policy suitable, which features make it unsuitable, and overall should we recommend it. And we do that for each country. So there's 3 paragraphs for each country. And then we've got a conclusion where they just rank the countries according to which one it's going to be most effective in and which one it's going to be least effective in. This is just a teacher information page at the back, and that link there is going to link you to this page here where you've got those random policy generators. To add a bit of pizzazz, unnecessary pizzazz, one might say, I would maybe allow a 3-chance stick or twist for their policies. So you could say, okay, do you want to stick with this policy or risk it and try and get a different policy? But if they risk it and they get a new policy, they can't go back to this one. So then it'd be like, okay, well, now you've got, fund public transport subsidies to reduce fares. And again, you can give them one more chance. If they want to stick with this, they can. Or they could have another go at clicking the generate policy button, but of course it could be a worse or more difficult policy. What do they want to do? As I say, I'd really recommend not telling students what the policy is before they come into the lesson and not allowing them to be using their computers for that purpose, because otherwise it's very easy to create these answers just by putting it through AI. That's how I did the model answer. Whereas we actually want them to think here, so they can use the research that they've done with AI as part of their country profiles to help to guide them. But we ideally want them to be thinking through this themselves. And that's the World Cup project. So that would take probably, depending on how many you've got in your group, maybe 3 lessons. It may be that you want to spend some time going through this model answer and explaining how we do application properly in Macro. That might take a little bit more time. If you've got more students, you might need to do more presentations, and therefore that might take more time too. But yeah, I hope that's useful. As I say, if you want to skip the presentation bit, you could just ask them to research those countries and bring in their notes. And skip straight to that second part. That would work too. I hope some of this is useful.